Hey guys, so there is a historical debate which asks the question, was Hitler a strong dictator or was he a weak dictator? And this is known as the Intentionalist versus the Structuralist or Functionalist debate. So there's a bit to unpack here, but I actually studied this at college level, so I've got a bit of understanding of it. Anyway, Guy Andrews asked, hi Tik, in regards to the Nazi state and the inner workings of the state itself, would you regard yourself as being an intentionalist or a structuralist in the historical debate? So this is an interesting question, because from what I understood, we had moved on from this debate. So I'm going to actually talk about the debate itself. It's still important, and even though we have kind of moved on from it, I think it's worth us going back to it for a couple of reasons, as you'll see at the end. So, the older view is the intentionalist view, and this was what dominated the historiography, what historians thought after the war, and it basically said that individuals created history, or that individuals dominate history, and that most of the events can be explained through individuals. And so Hitler was to blame for everything because he was a strong dictator, and what he did was, this is what they said, was that he divided the state into competing departments, let's say, or competing entities within the state. These were competing against each other, and basically it was chaos, or organised chaos at best, and they're all competing each other, and sometimes they competed for bad reasons, like one would outcompete another even though the other had the right idea, and so on and so forth, and it basically created confusion and chaos within the state. But this was intentional because they say that Hitler could take advantage of this confusion, let's say, and then rule over it, and thus he was a strong dictator because it basically placed all power in his hands. You know, if two competing departments were fighting against each other or whatever, it was down to Hitler to make the decision, actually I favour this one, or actually I favour this one, or whatever. So it actually made him the final say, or had the final say in all the arguments or whatever. So it put all the power into his hands. And so because of all this power, I'm doing this to show you the hierarchy of society, by the way. So the hierarchy of society, he's at the top here. And so what this means is that if he's the strong dictator and he has the final say, or even the first say, in a lot of the infighting or the debates or whatever you want to call it inside the Third Reich, then that means that the ideology flowed downwards, and that Hitler made the decisions for things like the Holocaust or World War II or whatever it is. So that it's all Hitler's fault in a sense, or it's mostly his fault, him and his cronies at the top, and the ideology flowed downwards, and thus mass murder, which is World War II and the Holocaust and so on, this was intentional, right? Because it came from Hitler, he made the decisions, and it flowed downwards. So yeah, in a sense, it's all Hitler's fault. But it was basically a top-down structure, intentionalist structure of the way that the Third Reich operated. And then you have the structuralist debate. Now this is a bit newer than the intentionalist debate. From what I can gather, it came about in the 70s or the 80s, the 1980s. And the emphasis now wasn't really so much on individuals as events, and even, you know, lots of people, groups, you could say. And so they said that history was shaped by groups and events, and so Hitler was a weak dictator because he didn't plan so well the hierarchy of the state or whatever, and didn't really give it proper direction. And so they said that the state was disorganized and chaotic because of Hitler, because Hitler failed to create that order in the first place, and this was his weakness. And so because he failed to create the order in his regime, there was a competitive nature in the Nazi state, and so there was no unity, there was no okay, we want the Holocaust to happen, or whatever it is that, it just kind of happened naturally because there was no real leadership at the center, shall we say, or at the top. Because of this, it was like, well, we'll compete and compete and compete, and as a result, a policy came from it. So it wasn't intentional. The structure of the state made it happen, or the function of the state made it happen, hence the terms structuralist, functionalist, etc. And so another term as well was the periphery, so the process of the movement. So all this fighting amongst themselves and whatever else, as a result of Hitler's weakness or lack of dictatorship capability, let's say, moved the let's say the orders, instead of having it at the top with Hitler saying, right, we're going to make the Holocaust happen, instead it was the bottom, it was the periphery, those on the outskirts, that made the Holocaust happen. So basically it's, instead of the center, it's the edges or the bottom. And thus they did not intend to mass murder from the beginning, but gradually grow, this process gradually evolved over time, and this was primarily because of the lower ranks. So this is a bottom heavy, bottom to the top sort of policy. So the intentionalist view, just to sum up, conclude those bits, or to remind you, is to say intentionalists are the top down, structuralists are bottom up. And that's how it was. And this debate went back and forth. And as I say, I looked at this in college, and yeah, the debate had kind of been solved. I say solved because I don't think it has been, but it's kind of been resolved, sort of, or we've gotten past it at least. And so what ended up happening, there was a few historians. The one that I was we discussed the most was Ian Kershaw. I think there was other ones as well. But I remember my teacher in college was very much like, oh my God, Kershaw's amazing, and talking about Kershaw, and she really loved him in more than one way. And so, yeah, so basically, let's say Ian Kershaw said, actually, neither side is correct here, because obviously, clearly, the structuralists have got a point, and clearly the intentionalists have got a point, right? So there's something, neither side are really winning here, because both sides are flawed in one way or another, and both sides are right on one way or another. So Ian Kershaw and others, I think it's Hans Monson and so on, they said actually there's a combination of the two. So the structuralists and the intentionalists became one. And when I read Kershaw, which I've got his books behind me, what he's saying is that, yeah, okay, everyone is working towards the Führer, and so as a result of that, then you can have Hitler being in charge and giving direction, but then leaving it to the subordinates to make the decision. And that way you get Hitler making the decisions, but at the same time it's the periphery also making decisions and also coming to the conclusion of what they need to do and figuring out the process of it. So Hitler kind of went, right, go and do that, and then everybody else kind of worked out to do it. And that is therefore not necessarily strong dictatorship, but it allows both the intentionalists to say, yeah, Hitler made the decisions, but it was the state that actually carried it through, and thus Hitler was a weak dictator in that sense, but gave direction to this mass movement. So it wasn't just like, oh, it just evolved over time and then boom, the Holocaust. It was actually, no, it was the intention all along, but technically Hitler is a weak dictator. So I've got Hitler has to settle the state, which doesn't require orders because it's working towards what he wants. Yeah. And then the competing agencies work towards him to complete the given task. And Hitler did not have a... Oh yeah, that's another point. They said that Hitler didn't have a master plan for the Holocaust, but he was the main director of it. And there is a debate about when he decided that the Holocaust was going to happen. And from what I've seen... And I think this is still the case, which is why it's important, because I think they're wrong. They say that Hitler only intended for the Holocaust to happen, or decided to start killing the Jews in, let's say, the late 30s, early 40s, or maybe at most you could say earlier in the 30s, but definitely not before then. And most of them say it was actually as a result of the failure of Barbarossa, or a similar sort of time like that's when Hitler made the decision to murder the Jews. And I don't agree with that. I think he made that decision a lot earlier than that, and we'll get into that. But this debate says, okay, actually, Hitler is still a weak dictator, right? At the top, he's still a weak dictator, but he is making the decisions, and then these competing organizations are competing for his favor. So he's still a weak dictator, like the Structuralist said, or the Functionalist said, but the bottom is strong, and thus he's still giving it direction, kind of thing. And so that's where we got up to in college, and I think that debate has kind of gone. But actually, I'm going to kind of dig it up a little bit here. So I'm quite glad Mr. Andrews here has given me the question, because it actually ties into what I've been saying on this channel. Right, I'm not disagreeing with the consensus in the sense of I think the structure's still there, and I think Hitler's making the decisions, but I think the way that the consensus currently is presented is not quite right. And so I don't think that Hitler was a weak dictator, and I don't think, because the way that it's still presented is, oh, okay, Hitler's a weak dictator because let's say he screwed up having this competition going on, right, in the ranks. And so what he should have done is made a much more unified state, so on and so forth, and then there wouldn't have been this competition. He could have just given an order and it would have been followed out, carried to the letter, and therefore he's a strong dictator. And currently he's not doing that, or he wasn't doing that, therefore he's a weak dictator. I disagree, because this is a fundamental misunderstanding of Nazi ideology. I'll come back to that. So the debate currently surrounds, it's kind of moved on, actually. I think it was kind of settled, sort of, but it's moved on to another thing, because this now presents the problem. Well, hold on. If Hitler is a weak dictator, then maybe he doesn't have total power. And if he doesn't have total power, then he's not a totalitarian. So was Hitler a totalitarian, right? So this is where the debate's moved on, because if Hitler's is an intentionalist, right? If you're an intentionalist, then Hitler's a strong dictator and therefore he's a totalitarian. If he's a weak dictator, then he hasn't got total power. And so this is the problem now. It's like, oh, is he a totalitarian or not? And so if he was a totalitarian, he's a strong dictator. If he wasn't a totalitarian, then he didn't have control over society, in which case you then got a few other problems. So if this current debate, the way it's been settled, with, let's say, Ian Kershaw saying, no, he's still a weak dictator, but he gave directions, well, then he's not a totalitarian dictator, in which case that's not necessarily the way, like, because, and then you've got, I think actually Ian Kershaw is one of those people who was actually arguing about whether he was a totalitarian or not. So it has actually moved on, it's not been settled properly. But in my view, I think Hitler was a totalitarian dictator. And so if he's not a weak dictator, he's therefore a strong dictator, and thus totalitarian. Let me try and explain it a different way. So he makes the decision, and he's created this state, and it's all competing against each other for reasons of the Nazi ideology. He makes a decision, he gives it to his subordinates, and his subordinates carry that out. Now, they are competing against each other, but they're competing against each other within the boundaries of the state in order to create whatever it is that Hitler wants to create. So he's still in power, he's still in charge, he's still in total command, because it's his first word and his final word in this sort of thing. And he's forcing them to compete, which is why he's a strong dictator. And yeah, so basically he's totalitarian in that sense. And this is where we go into the controversial bit, because that, all I've said so far is not really controversial to the modern day viewer, hopefully. We'll see. But this bit will be. Yay. This is where we get into was National Socialism capitalism or socialism? Because if Hitler is a capitalist, then he's not a totalitarian dictator, in which case he's weak. And he's also, the state is therefore weak, because you don't have a state under capitalism, or if you do, it's a weak state because everything is given to the very bottom of society, the private sector. So the public sector is weak. And so then at that point, it's pretty hard to explain how the Holocaust happened, because we know the Holocaust happened, obviously. But the question is, why or how? And those questions can't really be asked or answered, rather, if Hitler's a weak dictator. If Hitler's a weak dictator, then he doesn't give instructions down to the state, and the state doesn't carry it out because it's capitalist. It can't do, right? If all power is in the private hands or the private sector, then the public sector state doesn't have any power, right? And capitalism is private control of the means of production. So if Hitler is a weak dictator, if he's not totalitarian, if the state doesn't have total control, right, which is what it doesn't have under capitalism, then you do not have the state apparatus in order to create the Holocaust. And so, yes, the Holocaust happened, but you can't explain it. So this idea, the Marxist view that, oh, it's capitalism, doesn't work. And this is the problem, right? So the debate has moved on. So I'm saying, okay, Hitler is actually a socialist, so he is a totalitarian dictator, therefore he's strong and he's giving orders down to the state. The state is also strong, right? So this is a little bit different. It's not saying that, with Ian Kershaw, he's saying Hitler's a weak dictator and the state is strong, thus the Holocaust. I'm actually saying, no, Hitler's strong as well and the state is strong as well. It was a deliberate act from Hitler, so it was intentional. The state is strong, therefore structural, and the whole of society was united under the National Socialist Third Reich ideology, National Socialism, and this was a socialist, all within the state, nothing outside of the state mentality, and thus it then becomes possible to explain the Holocaust because, this is how I put it, racial socialism, National Socialism, racial socialism was in state control, total state control, totalitarian state control of the means of destruction. And so, there you go. So I actually sort of agree, but not fully, with the current consensus. But here's the problem. So most historians, I say the majority, don't think Hitler was a socialist. And they're still thinking that Marxist socialism is the only version of socialism, which it isn't, right? Socialism predates Marxism. Well, Hitler's ideology, National Socialism, is a different form of socialism compared to Marxism. So the historians don't know this. They assume that the Marxists are correct when the Marxists say, yes, it's capitalism, it's fascist imperialism, which is capitalism, which doesn't make any sense because this has nothing to do with fascism. And so they now have this problem where they can't explain how the Holocaust happened because the free market doesn't result in the Holocaust. The only way to get to the Holocaust is to have state control, right? And so, it's like the SS was not free capitalist organization. They were definitely socialist. They were definitely state control of the means of production. But again, they don't understand this. So, in my view, Hitler wanted to create a socialist state on the racial national level, with him at the top leading the way. But due to the fundamental flaw in National Socialism and its ideology, which I will get to, and I still need to do it, and I'm working on it, don't worry, I'll come back to that, Hitler couldn't ignore the social Darwinist issue, which forces him to have competition, right? Social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Therefore, if we have everything under the state, then there's no survival of the fittest. Therefore, we need to have competition within the state. That's why he creates a competing structure in the state, right? It's about the social Darwinism, which is the fundamental flaw in Nazi ideology. But I'll come back to that. And so this is why there is state competition within it, within the structure. That was intentional. And that's not a weakness because in terms of Hitler's ideology, or was Hitler a weak dictator, that is actually not a weakness because it's actually, if you think about it this way, it allows others to take ownership in order to get things done. It's basically delegation, right? And delegation isn't a weakness. Managers need to delegate all the time. That's not a weakness, it's a skill, and not everybody can do it. And so this weakness of competing against each other was actually a strength, and it was deliberate, it was intentional. Hitler did it on purpose because of the fundamental flaw in Nazi ideology, which is related to the social Darwinist issue. So then you get to the debate about Hitler wanting to kill the Jews. When did he want to kill the Jews? Was it in the late 30s and early 40s, or was it much earlier? I think he made it very clear in Mein Kampf that it was to be done. And I'll come back to the counter argument to that in a second, but what I've said, or what I am saying, is that Hitler set the goal of removing the Jews, in order to socialize the people under a socialist state. And people have complained about what does socialize the people mean. I don't know, ask Karl Marx, he said the same thing. Collectivize the people. Whatever you want to, collective control, collectivize, socialize the people, right? Under a racial socialist state. And then everyone else was working towards him as a result of setting up this state. So Hitler was set up in this socialist state because public sector control of the means of production is socialism. So he set up this public sector socialist state control of the means of production state, socialist state, but for the race, and in order to do that, the Jews had to be removed from the state, right? That's how he thought of it. It's silly. And so the state is now working towards him in order to fulfill that. And that was all intentional. And so the debate then goes about, when did Hitler want to remove the Jews? When did he decide to do this? The original argument said Mein Kampf doesn't say that specifically that Hitler wants to murder the Jews. There's only one sentence right at the end of Mein Kampf where it says about if he says back to World War One, if only more Jews had been killed, and he uses the word gas. If more Jews had been killed in World War One, then this would have meant we would have won the war, right? This is what he says, and that's the only real sentence. So, some people have argued that actually says about killing Jews, and therefore, because it's just one sentence, you can't really take that as meaning that he said in Mein Kampf he wants to kill the Jews. It doesn't mean that. Maybe he just wanted to get rid of them, and thus they could go to Madagascar or whatever. There's different arguments to that. But that's not actually true. When you read Mein Kampf properly, he says it all the way through it. So let me give you one quote, but I'll give you some more. He says, the nationalization of the masses can be successfully achieved only if, in the positive struggle to win the soul of the people, those who spread the international poison among them are exterminated. Right? So he doesn't say the word Jew, but the words international poison mean Jews, right? Because Hitler thinks international Jewish finance, international Jewish capitalism, or stock exchange capital, because he uses all these different terms, he thinks that this international Jewish conspiracy is going to take over the world, right? So he's against it. And so this is a conspiracy of both capitalism and Marxism, and he says he wants to exterminate them, and he also wants to destroy it or stop it, etc. And that's the only way you can do that, by socializing the people. So he also says here, the Marxist leaders whose business consisted in deceiving and misleading the public naturally hated most of all a movement whose declared aim was to win over those masses which hitherto had been exclusively at the service of international Marxism, right? International Marxism in the Jewish and stock exchange parties. The title alone, German Labour Party, irritated them. I can't get my words out today. So he's saying the international Marxism and the international Jewish stock exchange or capitalist parties are working together in an evil conspiracy. And he says this throughout, these are just a couple of quotes. He says this throughout Mein Kampf. So it's like, no, it's definitely there. And he definitely says, as I said before, the only way to socialize and prevent this from happening is to, quote, exterminate, quote, the international poison, right? That's what he's saying. So he actually says this throughout Mein Kampf. There's loads of quotes. And so these critics who say there's only a couple of sentences that in Mein Kampf that link the Jews to mass extermination are wrong. This is incorrect. This is a misinterpretation. And the reason why they misinterpreted it is because they don't believe that they think Hitler is a capitalist. Well, if he's a capitalist, he's for international finance. He's for international capitalism. So, well, they don't quite grasp it. They're not seeing it correctly. And they don't seem to understand Hitler's racial theory of history, which calls for both socialism, which is a third way between capitalism and Marxism, whilst saying that socialism would be the only possible route, and it would only be possible if they remove the Jews from the nation or society. And he makes it very clear that he wanted to murder the Jews in order to make this society possible. So Hitler's National Socialism demands the removal of the Jews from society. Well, because they think, they've basically dismissed the idea that Hitler was anti-capitalist, because they think he is capitalist, because they believe the Marxists when they said, yes, fascism is capitalism. It's like, Hitler's not a fascist, and even then fascism isn't to do with capitalism, because Mussolini wasn't a capitalist. But A, Hitler's not a fascist, B, neither of them are capitalist anyway, and C, they've completely just missed most of Mein Kampf, which basically is against capitalism and Marxism, right? So you've got the political spectrum in the Nazi view, which is on the right, you've got capitalism, on the left, you've got Marxism, and Hitler's version is in the middle. You have a National Socialist third way, or even a fascist third way. In the fascist case, it's the nation that's going to be united against the in a social nation, socialist nation, versus the Marxists and the capitalists, whereas the National Socialists are going to make a racial socialist state which attacks both Marxism and capitalism, because Hitler sees both Marxism and capitalism as being Jewish, and the only way to stop the evil conspiracy is to create a national social state. And so that's what he's doing. So once you grasp that, and once you see actually Hitler is dead against the idea of capitalism, which he sees as the same as Jews, and he's against the idea of Marxism, which again he sees as being Jewish, then it makes sense that he wants to be in the middle, in a socialist party for the nation, or in his case, the race. And so, yeah, but historians have dismissed this. They think he's capitalist, therefore they don't see the anti-capitalist stance that Hitler makes, and they don't understand his socialism, and they think that Marxism is socialism and socialism is Marxism, which is just not the case. Socialism predates Marxism. So they are completely misinterpreting Mein Kampf. And that's why that's basically why I'm holding my ground on this, because, and what I'm doing, I'm making a major response video at the minute to the criticism that I've received, because a lot of the counter arguments don't stand up to scrutiny. It's very easy to go, TIK's wrong, and it's like, no, that doesn't work. Hitler killed Ernst Röhm, therefore he's not a socialist. It's like, okay, Hitler killed Ernst Röhm, therefore he's not German either. Like, what a stupid argument. Oh, you think that when a party's got socialism in the name, then it's socialist, therefore I guess you think the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea is democratic. And it's like, well, it is. Socialism is apparently, according to Karl Marx, Engels, Lenin, Hitler, and Mussolini, who are all socialists, and others, socialism is the highest form of democracy. So yeah, North Korea is democratic according to their own principles. But anyway, let's just ignore that. So yeah, this criticism doesn't make any sense, but I think now this intentionalist, structuralist, was Hitler a weak or strong dictator, has moved on to the debate about whether he was totalitarian or not, and that's centered around the idea of, was he a capitalist or socialist? Because if he's a capitalist, he's not a totalitarian dictator. If he's a socialist, then he is a totalitarian dictator, but all the Marxists are going to be crying. So it's like, well, I don't care whether the Marxists cry or not. I'm not changing history just because some people's feelings are going to get hurt, right? You're not allowed to clap anymore, you've got to do this. So I'm not bothered about the snowflakes, let them cry. I'm more interested in the truth and also explaining why the Holocaust happened. right? So I think this is where people are having a go at me. It's like, no, actually, this is a debate. This is at the forefront of the historiography, in my opinion, unless it's been resolved, but I don't think it has been. Certainly not with the literature I've been reading. And so, yeah, I'm making a major upcoming response video whose script is much longer than I thought it would be, but it's so far 30,000 words long and it's not finished. And I'm going to be filling in the details properly and showing exactly where and why Hitler says he wants to remove the Jews in Mein Kampf, and his speeches, and where he's anti-capitalistic, and why his regime is socialist, even though it has a major fundamental ideological flaw in it, which allows competition to take place in itself. Even though technically, as a socialist, he shouldn't have had that, but he has to have it because he's a racist. But I'll get into that in the future. So, that's basically it. But in the meantime, if you want to understand where I'm coming from a bit more, I would always recommend the book Hitler, the Politics of Said, which I can't say the full word because YouTube will demonetize the video, which is by Zeitelman, Rainer Zeitelman, who was writing in the 1990s, late 1990s, and he makes very good points when it comes to National Socialist ideology. Bit of a hard book to get into, but it's great. And you could also watch my public versus private video, which explains the terms capitalism and socialism and explains why, at least in principle, Hitler's ideology is socialist, which will then put you in instead for when I make this response video. So there you go. So I'm going to also, what I'll do, if you want to read more about the weak versus strong dictator debate, the intentionalist versus structuralist functionalist debate, I'll leave some articles in the description as well. So I'm going to leave it there, guys. Let me know what you think about anything I've said, and I'll see you next time. I'm going to enjoy the comments for this one. Bye for now.